The United States has managed to end 2022 avoiding a deep crisis, but it could still be too early to claim victory, and a dangerous time bomb is inflating in its economy, with many completely unaware of its existence, but its explosion could materialize very soon. The Federal Reserve, as the central bank of the United States, is the main responsible for the inflation that the country is experiencing and is also primarily responsible for solving it. But someone unexpected has crossed its path: the American consumers, who, despite high inflation and the increase in credit costs, have not reduced their consumption and have made the Federal Reserve measures much less effective than expected, and throughout this year inflation has surprised everyone by exceeding estimates on multiple occasions. And the Federal Reserve, like any central bank, has at its disposal the increase in interest rates as its main tool to fight inflation. With increases in interest rates, it seeks to get people to save more and consume less, due to the increase in the cost of borrowing money. And in this way, the supply of products and services can match the amount of money available in the economy, and prices can stabilize. But if people continue to consume at the same levels, then the Fed actions will be less effective. And obviously the problem is not that the directors of the Federal Reserve are having a hard time at work. After all, they asked for what is happening.
I think we now understand better how little we understand about inflation.
That's not very reassuring.
The problem is that it's not free for consumers to behave this way, and a dangerous time bomb is being created and could set off America's next economic crisis. Because people have avoided reducing their consumption through two ways. The first is by ending their savings, which have reached minimums in the last 17 years, while the savings rate is only 2.3%, the second lowest in the last 6 decades since the measure began to be reported. And the second is through the use of credit cards, which accumulate the largest debt in the history of the United States, and the average interest rates, which already reach 16.3% and are the highest of the century in this country, have not served to discourage their use. And this ticking time bomb will go off when people are unable to access more credit or end up depleting their savings in the equivalent of widespread bankruptcy for the American consumer. An event that will seriously hit the economy. Because the United States economy, which is based 68% on consumption, managed to avoid a deep crisis this year thanks to the fact that its citizens supported it, but without solving the underlying problem that will return next year and find consumers more indebted and with less savings. And although the United States entered a technical recession when its economy declined during the first 2 quarters of the year, it was such a weak contraction and with such a low unemployment rate that the institution in charge of declaring recessions, the National Bureau of Economic Research, declined to do so. And when economic growth occurred in the 3rd quarter of the year, the page was turned on this issue. But the threat of a crisis, which has seen stock markets across the board plunge this year, and some of the world's biggest companies like Tesla, Meta, and Amazon lost more than half their market value, still exists. And expectations for the coming year remain negative, with surveys of economists and analysts estimating the chances of an economic crisis at between 60% and 100%. And the discussion is focused more on the type of crisis that will be, the behavior that inflation will have, and not whether the crisis will occur or not, which is taken for granted. If you have found this information useful, remember to subscribe and share this video so we can increase our reach and inform more people. When the consumer is finally unable to maintain this vicious circle and demand falls, a domino effect will begin that will finally lead to the economic crisis. Less demand from consumers will imply less sales for companies, which, like many technology companies this year, will have to readjust their investments and start laying off employees. The increase in unemployment will further worsen demand, and the crisis that was expected this year will finally occur. How bad it will be will depend on several things, but with inflation at the center of 3 scenarios. In the first scenario, the drop in demand allows prices to stabilize and the Federal Reserve is left with room to maneuver and to lower interest rates to help the economy recover. This assumes there are clear signs that inflation will not spike again if this happens, and that the Federal Reserve will be rational and patient with its decision, which is something that many economists and investors like Michael Burry, Peter Schiff and Nouriel Roubini consider it unlikely and believe that the Federal Reserve will end up giving in to the pressure of people, companies, and markets to lower interest rates and print money again, with devastating consequences for inflation, the dollar, and the economy in the long term. In the second scenario, somewhat related to this, the drop in demand is not enough to lower inflation and there is a period of stagflation, which according to a Deutsche Bank survey of 856 financial professionals, 22% consider this scenario as the most dangerous of those that could be experienced next year and give it a 62% probability of occurring. Stagflation occurs when there is economic decline and at the same time there is inflation. It is a particularly difficult scenario because it leaves central banks with little choice but to weather the economic crisis until inflation subsides. And the third scenario, where several of the main concerns of the financial analysts consulted by Deutsche Bank come together, is due to inflation much higher than expected. A scenario like the previous one, but with higher inflation that could be caused by a reduction in production, both nationally and internationally, which decreases the availability of products and keeps prices high. If something like this happens, the Federal Reserve would be forced to be stricter and raise its interest rates more, causing a deepening of the economic crisis due to a greater drop in demand and a greater increase in the financing costs of companies and government. Because, although in 2022 the United States government reduced its deficit by eliminating the remaining subsidies that it still maintained due to the pandemic, it still has a fiscal deficit and as such, its debt continues to grow. And the interest that it must eventually pay for it will be each increased by the increase in interest rates by the Federal Reserve. This implies that, on the government spending side, higher inflation would also translate into higher government spending on interest and less investment money, also deepening the crisis on this side. The government ends up being a faithful reflection of its citizens, and spending more than its income, its debt increases. It must pay more and more interest, and the more time passes, the more painful the outbreak will be, and the more belt-tightening will have to be done to overcome the crisis. And in these three scenarios, it is important to consider the international effect. The United States is not alone at an economic level, and as the largest importer, second largest exporter, and having the largest economy in the world, it can infect the rest of the world with its crisis, as happened in 2008, but it can also be infected or its situation be worsened by what happens in the rest of the world, as could be the case in 2023. With the economic and energy crisis in Europe, the slowdown of the Chinese economy due to its real estate and demographic crisis, and the war in Ukraine generating extra pressures for the U.S. economy, worsening inflation and decreasing demand for U.S. products and services. With an escalation of the war in Ukraine being selected by 24% of those surveyed by Deutsche Bank as one of the biggest risks facing the economy, and an escalation of the trade war between the United States and China selected by 10%. Which do you think is the most likely scenario? Will this crisis come from the United States, or will it be infected by what is happening in the rest of the world? I would like to know your opinion. See you next time.